Okay, let's start. Good afternoon. Welcome to this roundtable of the International Institute on Brexit. My name is Geneviève Zubrzycki. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and I will be moderating this panel. And before I say a few words and introduce our speakers today, I would like to ask everyone to make sure that your cell phone is turned off. We always forget. So that would be great. And also, you must have noticed that you had little flashcards on your chair with a pen. Given the size of the audience, we find it most practical if you actually write your question. And at the end, you can pass it along. We'll have people picking them up on either side of the room. And then I will read your questions. I'd be grateful if you try to be as clear in your handwriting as possible. So today we're talking about Brexit, which is the common name given to the June 23rd, 2016 referendum, in which 51.9% of voters in the UK voted to leave the EU. So we woke up the following morning here on this side of the Atlantic, surprised, shocked, and with a good dose of disbelief. And that dose of disbelief was also from what we heard on the BBC and NPR and in lots of newspaper news outlets, a good dose of disbelief by people who had voted for Brexit themselves, that they didn't think this was going to come through. They voted for Brexit actually because they were voting against a host of other things. For example, they were voting, it was a vote against, because of the economy, immigration, because of regional disparities. They were also taken with the rise of populist politics, charismatic leaders. There's all sorts of reasons why people voted for the UK leaving the EU. And so I convened a group of scholars, distinguished scholars from the University of Michigan, with very different expertise and disciplinary approaches that are different. So we have two historians, a political scientist and a legal scholar. And what we're going to do for the next hour and a half is discuss, first of all, the causes of the Brexit vote, the potential consequences of Brexiting for all involved, that is, the citizens of the UK, the non-citizens but residents in the UK. So I'm thinking of a lot of Poles. I work on Poland, so lots of Poles who have actually invested, bought property, etc. What's going to happen to them? And the process of Brexiting itself. What does it entail? And we'll conclude with reflections on the lessons of, that we might learn from the Brexit vote, even as far as, the North American continent and the US more specifically. So this is basically the agenda for today. And now I will present our speakers. Kali Israel is Associate Professor in the Department of History. She specializes in modern British and Scottish history with her research on women, modernity, and cosmopolitanism in the late 19th and early 20th century Edinburgh. She just returned from Scotland, and today she'll provide us with a brief historical contextualization of the vote for Brexit, paying attention to the dynamics of party politics, and then she will address the constitutional and political issues regarding Scotland and Northern Ireland more specifically, and this is a very important issue. Our second speaker, joining us from Germany here in the room with us, but actually about to fall asleep, I assume, is Daniel. I'm sorry, Daniel, I'm going to have to say your name with my French accent because otherwise I can't say it. Halberstam, who's the Eric Stein Collegiate Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty and Research. He's a specialist of U.S. constitutional law, European Union law, comparative constitutional law, and global governance. He will discuss the legal and structural causes behind the Brexit vote and the many legal issues with Brexiting per se. Pauline Jones is professor of political science and director of the International Institute. Her work focuses on newly emergent states with multiple competing subnational identities, states transitioning from planned to market economies, states rich in natural resources, and states with predominantly Muslim populations. The empirical basis of her work has been primarily Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union. And today, Pauline will cover the political and economic implications of Brexit for Russia specifically, what Russia may gain or lose from Brexit, and how that in turn affects the rest of the world. Finally, Joshua Cole is professor of history. His work deals primarily with the social and cultural history of France in the 19th and 20th centuries, with special attention to the history of colonial violence and the politics of memory in France, Algeria, and Germany. He will conclude the panel with a reflection on the quote-unquote trilemma of contemporary politics with Brexit that Brexit captures, namely that nation-state can't simultaneously have democracy, national sovereignty, and full integration into the global economy, and he will relate that argument to the situation in the UK, to that of the rise of the right elsewhere in Europe and in the US as well. So without further ado, I welcome Kali Israel for his first set of comments.
I did take the instructions to brevity seriously, but I will also keep a close eye on the clock. This will not be an extensive historical overview. In fact, I'm just going to make a few, more or less, bullet points of historical overview. One thing to note is that there is a much longer history of British relationships to international institutions than simply that of the European Union. And I don't mean only things like United Nations, League of Nations, etc., but any number of international agreements formulated over time. That is, it is not new to think about nations voluntarily binding themselves to engage in international law or international institutions. However, during the Brexit debate, very little of this was heard in any way. The historical amnesia about the history of British relations with international institutions was very, very strong. Second bullet point, as I said, I'm really cramming these in. In the post-war period, that is since 1945, British attitudes towards Europe have often been strongly shaped by or interacted with British attitudes or British ideas about the relationship to the United States. The belief on the part of many post-1945 British politicians that there was a choice to be made between being wholeheartedly in Europe or being closely connected to the United States is, in retrospect, a false choice, but it was a powerful political context for the history of Britain's interaction with European institutions even before the EU. In other words, what I'm pointing to is that there's a history of the fantasy of the special relationship. The paradox is that the US has often supported British closer involvement with Europe. However, British politicians and British decision makers have not necessarily heard what was being said to them. Third large point, the longer British history is also connected to the history of empire, as well as, and this overlaps, these are not separate points, the way in which many British people understand their experience or their national experience of the two 20th century world wars in ways which did not include the empire. That is, the understanding of the meanings of both World War I and World War II often focus on the British archipelago and the empire only as a zone of combat of white British people, as opposed to a larger understanding of Britain's imperial position in both world wars as well as between and after them. So those are three sort of big points right away. I want to add slightly to the third one there about imperialism. In the more recent past, there have been times of significant resurgence of imperial nostalgia. And particularly, I would point to the 1980s, that is the Thatcher era. But one could also point to the soft pedaling of the history of British imperialism by some more recent British politicians, particularly conservatives, and pointing to the drastic, and I could use stronger words, underrepresentation of the history of empire in British education, and I would say particularly in English education. In my nastier moments, which come along from time to time, I've added an addendum to the numerous commenters who have made a connection between Brexit and 1956 as the two great crises in their lifetime. Neil Asherson most eloquently, 1956 being Suez. My nasty addendum is that part of what caused Brexit is that we are also dealing with people for whom Suez never happened. The historical amnesia about empire is, as well as the historical nostalgia for empire, are a very important context which I think needs much more exploration than it got during the debates leading up to the referendum itself. So, moving on again to just sort of the big points. Ambivalence about Europe has also been a cross-partisan issue from the beginning. That is, the relationship of Britain to Europe has divided the Labour Party as well as the Conservative Party. That is a fairly simple point, but I think that in terms of unwinding what happened in the last year or so, it is important to remember that some of these debates have taken place before. And my last large generic point before shifting to some specific places, there is an enormous transfer of language, sort of the phrasing that somehow I wrote down, in terms of the language about migration and migrants today from earlier periods. And enormous doesn't really cover that. I was struck at times by the wide-eyed sympathetic note struck by some commenters on how leave-tending voters, that is, those who were thinking of or planning on or subsequently did vote leave. Some commenters wrote about or spoke about these people in terms of how they were just understandably fuddled and confused and anxious by the sudden presence of people who couldn't trace their ancestry back to the Domesday Book in their towns and in their streets and indeed in their supermarkets. This was perhaps well meant, but it's certainly naive. The language of swarming, the language of floods, the language of sudden shocking encounters with difference of any kind, those are not new. And there's a history of this that, like the history of post-imperial nostalgia, got relatively little exploration during the campaign. But this also points, I think, particularly in my underlining that point of language, the role of the press, not just the role of the press in the present, but the role of specific elements of the British press over the last 40 years. So, moving on to Scotland and Northern Ireland. Neither of these is very easily summarized, but in regard to Northern Ireland, I'll make several points. Northern Ireland went 56% Remain, which is perhaps startling, especially when you recognize that there are a number of people in Northern Ireland who have a very strong investment in a language of Britishness and sovereignty. Right. So there's a Northern Irish puzzle to be unpacked. But what I really want to emphasize is that the Leave campaign and those who were in government as well as those on the sideline apparently did not give the slightest thought to the consequences of Brexit for Northern Ireland, either in practical terms or larger terms. The practical issue is clearly the border. A border which could not be secured during the highest levels of military and paramilitary conflict in the past, just pointing that out. But there's also the fact that in both conceptual and constitutional terms, the European Union has been part of the peace process. It was conceptually an important space. Europeanness was conceptually an important resource for thinking about non-exclusive, overlapping forms of identity and sovereignty, as opposed to those which could only be sorted out in blood. And in the run-up to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, common membership in the EU was a very important point. The European Convention on Human Rights is a groundwork for the Good Friday Agreement. That is different from membership in the EU, but there is a relationship there. And politically, there is legitimate concern that a post-Brexit UK would attempt to depart from the Convention as well as from the Union. That would have political consequences. Moreover, if Northern Ireland is taken out of the EU against the majority of its own voters' wishes, arguments against it remaining in the UK are strengthened on democratic grounds. That is, some people argue of unification with the Republic of Ireland can make a democratic argument on the basis of the will of the governed. And maybe finally, in relationship to Northern Ireland is a huge beneficiary of membership in the EU, about £2.5 billion in the last round of EU funding. The single market has also fostered ties across the border, as well as sideways, so to speak, and the ability of people in Northern Ireland to live, work, and study in other places. That's not unique to Northern Ireland. What may be more important to stress as, if not unique, at least important for Northern Ireland needs normality. Northern Ireland continues to need time to recover, time to establish normal political institutions, time to live in a context other than crisis. And the uncertainty, crisis, bitterness that the recent events have created are not to be welcomed. As Catherine Gaw wrote in The Guardian, to install physical checkpoints along the border will instantly undermine a hard-won peace. The psychological impact alone of barricaded towers and armed checkpoints will stir up again emotional memories of people in a variety of ways. And then there's Scotland, where 62% voted Remain, 74% in Edinburgh, where I lived, 78%. Every electoral district in Scotland voted Remain. The closest margin was in an area called Morayshire, where the vote was clearly affected by some specific issues around fishing. After the vote, a couple of days afterwards, despite political differences, which can be quite sharp, in the Holyrood Parliament, every member of the Scottish Parliament voted to support attempts to find some way for Scotland to remain in the EU. So the Scottish story is clearly a quite specific one with a lot of dimensions, including some important legal ambiguities I hope Daniel will be able to help with. For example, there are different interpretations of something called the Sewell Convention. Named after Lord Sewell, who was the minister in office at the time it was written, which says that the UK Parliament may not legislate for devolved matters, that is, things within the remit of the Scottish Parliament, without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. That was initially set out in a memorandum of understanding, then later in statutory terms, and it remains confusing. So if you're feeling like, God, that's confusing, it's because it's confusing. It's not simply a matter of reasonable people disagreeing, it's a matter of highly trained, highly paid lawyers disagreeing. So I'm not going to go there, but there are some very complicated legal and constitutional issues at that level of constitutionality. But what I would want to sort of put out there, and I know it's not news to a number of you, over the history of the Union of Scotland with the other nations of Great Britain since 1707, support for the Union, that is, support for the treaty and the subsequent act signed in 1707, was a dominant and honorable form of Scottish political patriotism, indeed a form of Scottish nationalism. The history of contemporary events in Scotland does not run back to Bannockburn or Flodden. It runs back to the 1980s. It has to do with the shifts in British political culture beginning in the run-up and then continuing through the government of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, during which support for the Conservative Party collapsed in Scotland. There were 22 Conservative members of Parliament from Scotland in 1979. In 1997, there were 0. Right now, there's 1, and there's a joke about pandas involved in that. And yet, the Conservatives were in power from 1979 to 1997. That is, in the relatively recent past, what has been made abundantly clear is that despite the language of the Act of Union, and despite dominant understandings for a couple of hundred years, this is not a union of equals, but it is a union in which Scotland's voice can be absolutely and entirely irrelevant to decision making, and in which the political views of the Scottish people are impotent. So, last thing that I will say, because clearly I did over-prepare, yep. One in terms of a context we can follow on. Contemporary ideas about Scottish independence were forged in a context of Europe. The context of contemporary SNP politics and other pro-independence politics is a European context. I can say more about that. The other thing that I will say, picking up on something Geneviève pointed out, in the 2014 Scottish referendum on independence, EU citizens resident in Scotland had the vote. In the more recent referendum, they did not. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, it's your turn.
Very good. Josh, if, the sound has been cutting in and out, so if you could just make some gesture if you can't hear me anymore, so I don't just keep on talking.
Good, we can hear you.
Is that okay? Good, okay. So just give me a thumbs down when it cuts out. So thank you very much, and thanks for accommodating this schedule. So I will talk a little bit about the causes of the EU and then about the legal consequences. And so let me just start with the causes. You could sort of describe it as the populist awakening meets the European democratic deficit. I like to think about it this way. The European Union seems to have a Groucho Marx problem. Now, Groucho Marx, right, famously said he wouldn't want to join any club that would want to have him as a member. So what's going on in Europe is that the member states, the only club the member states, in particular the UK, seem to want to create is a club that they don't want to be a member of. And here's what I mean. On the one hand, member states have limited their own national powers. At the same time, however, they did not, 1, give the European Union the necessary powers to make up for the loss of power at the national level, and 2, they have not given the European Union a sufficient political space in which to legitimate the European Union and the few powers that they're giving them. So at the end of the day, you have what I'd like to call an imbalanced federation, essentially a club that nobody wants to be a member of. So to take the powers problem first, and the Euro crisis is probably a good example. Just think about that. In the European Union crisis, how did that come about? Well, there was an economic downturn in Europe. Sure, happens everywhere. Why does the European Union fall apart, or nearly fall apart, as a result of it? That's because the European Union has limited the powers of the member states to control their currency. So when the Greek currency would have gone south as a currency on its own, it would have simply gotten cheaper. That would have attracted tourists, that would have attracted investment, and more money would have flowed into Greece. Instead, the European Union eliminated Greece's power to regulate its own currency and to react locally to pressures of a downturn economy. At the same time, they did not give the European Union the corresponding powers to ship money into Greece. So in the United States, if there's a downturn in one state, we have a vast federal budget and we just send in money to basically help out the states, or we send in workers, we send in all sorts of things. So we have a huge federal budget in the US, and so therefore a single currency makes sense. In the European Union, again, they eliminated member state control over the currency, but they did not give the corresponding power to the center. That's an imbalanced federation on the level of powers. On the second, think about the politics problem. Just think about the president of the EU Council, president of the EU, current and past president. Who can name who they are in this audience? I'm not going to cold call. Probably nobody. And why is that? It's actually no surprise. Once again, the European member states, the member states of the EU, gave you a European Union, but they didn't have the courage or the guts to actually put in place politicians who would act at the level to legitimate the powers that they got. So that's, if you look, for example, the politician you all probably do know is Angela Merkel, right? And that's also no surprise. It was actually Angela Merkel, for instance, in 2009, who blocked Tony Blair from becoming the first president of the European Council. He was actually a candidate. Now, if Tony Blair had become the first European Council president, you probably would have heard about it, but you didn't. Instead, they prevented Tony Blair from becoming the first council, and instead it was Herman Van Rompuy, someone you've probably never heard about. Instead, you hear about Angela Merkel. So again, the member states have created a European Union that doesn't have the powers that they've given up, and it doesn't even have the politics to legitimate the few powers that they have. So when the populist wrath hit the EU, sometimes it's presented as the little guys taking out the big bad European supergovernment. Instead, the way I see it, it's actually the Brits who have not gone against the big bad bully, but again against the weakest kid on the block. The weakest kid on the block, the one government around that actually doesn't have the powers to deliver and doesn't have the politics to legitimate its powers. So what do we do now after Brexit? This sort of gets into legal stuff, so moving from the political to the legal, although this first part was obviously also about the structural legal creation of the EU. So under Article 50, as you've probably heard, the UK needs to notify the EU Council of the UK's intention to leave the European Union. That would set into place a 2-year period during which they can negotiate a divorce agreement. And if they fail to negotiate a divorce agreement, the UK simply leaves the EU without an agreement whatsoever. Call that a raw exit. That is actually pretty bad for everybody involved, which is why, and it's extremely bad for the UK, and which is why in some ways the UK is in a bind about both wanting to trigger Article 50 because they want to get it over with, and they want to lock in the current referendum gain, at least the Brexiteers want to. At the same time, they're really scared about triggering Article 50, because once they trigger Article 50, the UK is sort of in a bad power negotiation position, because if they don't get the agreement that they like after 2 years, they're out of the EU without any provision whatsoever, without any provision on access to the European market whatsoever. So we're going to get back to that in just a second. So what happens if the UK actually does leave? If the UK actually does leave, as we already just heard from Kali, it's quite likely that you're going to have a second referendum in Scotland about Scottish membership in the in the United Kingdom. So if the UK leaves the EU, what you might not have is a Brexit. You might have sort of a small Britain exit. So the UK might not be left anymore. All you might have is Little Britain, not Great Britain anymore. And so that's going to be something that the UK doesn't want, and David Cameron certainly doesn't want to be remembered for the man who destroyed the United Kingdom. Is there another way to engineer this? Folks have been talking about this in terms of a kind of reverse Greenland option. Greenland left the European Union but still remained a member of Denmark. So Greenland is an island that's part of Denmark. They didn't want to be part of the EU, and so there was a referendum, and Greenland left the EU while Denmark stayed within the EU. So the question is, can we engineer something like that for the UK? What would that look like? Well, you could have the UK remain in the EU, but you could just negotiate modifications to the treaty such that EU law would not apply to England and Wales. So EU law would apply to the UK and to Scotland and to Northern Ireland. The UK would formally remain a member of the European Union, but EU law would not apply to England and Wales. That's the so-called reverse Greenland option. That's perfectly possible as a legal matter. Lawyers can construct many fanciful things. The question is whether that's going to fly politically. A former judge on the European Court of Justice called David Edwards, a Scot, called this just plain silly. That's a political consideration. I don't think he was talking about the legal possibility because it is actually quite possible in my mind to actually do this legally. The question is whether that is really an option anybody would want. What else can they do? The UK could leave and enter into an association agreement with the European Union, like Norway, or a bilateral agreement like Switzerland. What's in it there for the UK? Probably not very much. The one gain that they would have is they could say that, yes, we do have British sovereignty. Yes, the European Court of Justice does not have this grand power over our courts, but in concrete terms, they would pay almost just as much into the EU budget under either the Norway or the Swiss agreement, and they would have to accept all the free movement provisions that the Norwegians and that the Swiss accept. So neither the Norwegian option nor the Swiss option are really options that anybody wants in the UK. So that leads you to believe, well, maybe if once they see how all this plays out, they really shouldn't really go through with Brexit. Lots of people outside of the UK are talking about this. They're saying, oh, let's just have them roll this back. I don't quite see this on the ground in the UK, at least not in the government, at least not among parliamentarians, at least not how they're talking about it now. The government is saying that we want to notify by the end of the year, early next year. That's what Theresa May has said. There are significant constitutional questions. The Sewell Amendment, the Sewell Understanding is one thing. There are also other conventions and constitutional understandings involved surrounding the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, Scotland Act of 1998, Belfast Agreements, the EC Act of 1972. And these three acts, there is a significant constitutional question about whether or not the Parliament needs to take at least a vote before they can notify the European Council. This is a constitutional question within the EU, but it also has, a constitutional question within the UK, but it also has a corresponding EU law element to it. And many several people, including myself, do argue that Theresa May does not currently have the constitutional authority to notify the European Council that the UK intends to leave. My view is that to do that, she needs a vote of Parliament. And the idea is if they actually put it to parliamentary vote, you have two houses of Parliament involved. The House of Lords might be somewhat more skeptical than the House of Commons, even though the MEPs in the House of Commons used to be against Brexit, the majority of them. Even absent a re-election, since the referendum, the MEPs are now a majority in favor of Brexit. But who knows, after debate, after the passage of time, maybe they will review what Brexit really means for the UK. After all, nobody in the referendum asked the people, would you like to leave the European Union if that means blowing the UK to smithereens? Now that they know that that might actually be an option or a consequence of leaving the European Union, perhaps they would think about the issue somewhat differently. So why don't I just leave it at that, and we can talk about the other stuff in the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
So I want to go back one slide just so you can see that really nice cartoon looking at the bear swallowing one of the stars. Let's see what we'll wait for the PowerPoint to go up. It's one of my favorite Brexit cartoons. So you might be asking yourself, rightly so, why we would be talking about Russia in a panel that's about, or a roundtable that's really primarily about the European Union. After all, Russia is not a member of the European Union. Not only would it not want to be a member, but the European Union doesn't want it to be a member either. So we have the double Groucho Marx problem. So why should we talk about Russia? Well, Russia was the country voted most likely to benefit from Brexit. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but it was a common refrain sung both from Britain among those who were against against Brexit, right? So British Foreign Secretary Phil Hammond said, you know, if we leave, the only one that's going to benefit, or the country that's going to be the biggest beneficiary of our departure, is Russia. And the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Mike McFaul, tweeted that the only beneficiaries of Brexit would be the only beneficiary of Brexit would be Russia. The big losers would be the U.S., the U.K., the EU, basically everybody except Russia. And so the question really is why. So first of all, we should talk about it because it was the country voted. Whoops, that's too early. What happened to slide number 2? Yeah, well, so you get the idea. I don't know. Slide number 2 has disappeared, but you get the idea. Fast forward, you know, there's lots at stake. So it's a country voted most likely to benefit, primarily because there's lots at stake economically and geopolitically. There's consequences for Russia's economy in the short term, which have already started to take place, and not just for Russia, but you know, across Europe. And but there's also oh, I'm sorry. That was my fault. Okay. So, excuse me. So that was the right slide, actually. So this was Putin's response, right? That and it was actually something that was in Mike McFaul's inbox that came from some of the elite within Russia. That this is how Putin responded to the vote once the vote happened, right? So that's the first reason that Russia was the country voted most likely to benefit. The second reason. I'm not doing well here. The second reason is that there's lots at stake, economically and geopolitically, right? In the short term, all these economic consequences, and the possibility that there would be a relaxation of EU pressures on Russia and Russian foreign policy in Syria, Iraq, and other places, Ukraine, right? In the medium term, that this would mean a weaker EU, the departure of the UK, and possibly NATO. That it would give Russia greater access to EU markets, and that it would mean a stronger Eurasian Economic Union, which is the union of there are 5 member states there that include Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. The argument there, Russia has been advocating for a stronger relationship between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. And finally, that in the long term, it would mean a stronger Russia vis-a-vis Europe, right? So this is why Russia was said to benefit so greatly, or at least those are the ways in which Russia was supposed to benefit. That was the sort of what was at stake. Well, why? What was underlying this? So there were 2 primary assumptions that were underlying these arguments that Russia would ultimately be the biggest beneficiary. And one has to do with the role of the UK in the EU and how that was understood, and that UK, I guess, was central to the EU's strength, which really meant that the UK was central to the EU's unity. So without the UK, the EU would essentially disintegrate, right? That was sort of one of the presumptions underlying this. And the other is that the UK's views and the UK's dominance and the dominance of those views within the EU had something to do with the UK's close ties to the US. So the UK was viewed quite predominantly as the biggest anti-Russia proponent within the EU, and the biggest problem, if you will, for Russia when it came to negotiations with the EU, when it came to foreign policy or economic policy. So because of the UK's strength, and its tie both to the unity of the EU and the anti-Russian policies, at least this is the presumption, its departure would mean that it would no longer, the sanctions against Russia would go away, right? So that the UK is key to those continued sanctions, that the UK was key to the EU enlargement, the biggest supporter of that, particularly for the East Central European countries, right? That the UK was a driving force behind the EU's security and interventionist decisions, and that the UK was the main obstacle to Russian EU integration, right? So these are the presumptions behind why the departure of the UK would mean the benefits to Russia. But I would argue that this is absolutely not so clear-cut. Firstly, because the UK has actually played a much less, or a much, more limited role in the policy decisions that matter most to Russia. There are 4 policy decisions, essentially, that matter most to Russia when it comes to the EU. The first is the visa-free regime, this visa-free regime for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which you can only guess Russia would like to see not happen. And the UK has been a proponent of that. But the UK is not part of the visa-free regime, so it really can't vote on that, so it doesn't have a decision, any decision-making authority. Western sanctions and interventions, you can argue that other countries, including France and Germany, have been just as if not more so, interventionist when it comes to things like places like Syria. You can argue that there was a consensus and a united front when it came to intervention in Kosovo. So the UK hasn't been the driving force behind all of the interventions that you've seen, of the major interventions, including Kosovo and Syria, and Iraq, I would say. And in terms of sanctions, it's interesting that one of the first things the EU did after Brexit was to gather together and vote on maintaining sanctions against Russia. And of course, the vote it's something that has to go back to their home parliaments, right? But they wanted a sort of signal of strength that we're going to continue these sanctions even after the UK leaves. It was very interesting that they did that. So there's lots of reasons to think that the UK is not as central to sanctions as well as interventions as one might think, or as least as McFall and others have argued. When it comes to economic integration, this is something that neither Russia nor the EU is serious about, so it really doesn't matter whether the UK is in or out. And I can say more about that if people are interested afterwards. In terms of EU expansion, again, the UK is not the only country that supports the EU expansion to the Baltic states, or not to the Baltic states, they're already in, sorry, but to other parts, to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, other states. So, and that there are many ECE countries that wanted to leave, had very, I guess the polling numbers showed that they were as opposed to, or more opposed, more likely to leave the EU than the UK. So anyway, the UK also not being seminal to EU expansion. And finally, there's no guarantee that Germany or France is going to be any friendlier to Russia than the UK was. Germany, in fact, was the biggest opponent to Russia even joining the WTO. So there's some bad blood there as well. I mean, I think one of the things that the analysts that have argued it's really about the UK and the leverage of the UK have missed is that when it comes down to it, it's really about the domestic governments. I mean, as Daniel was saying, the EU is very weak. This really has to do with the domestic government supporting the policies of the EU. The EU itself doesn't really make or implement policies. So it really comes down to what are the governments in Germany and France like. I mean, the Cameron government was very anti-Russia, but the Theresa May government seems to want some kind of rapprochement with Russia. So this could actually lead to a stronger relationship between the UK and Russia and not a weaker one. So Russia could benefit, but in a very different way from some of the commentary that we've seen. So thank you.
Joshua Gordon.
Hello. Can you hear me? Oops, if I put this up a little bit. How's that?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So my task today is to provide a big picture, which is good because I'm a little hazy on a lot of these details that we've been hearing from other people. So for me, what's really interesting here is the ways that we can see the Brexit vote as simply one instance among many in which significant numbers of voters in Western democracies have rejected the advice of mainstream politicians and economists and other experts and embraced what seems, at least in my opinion, to be the radical posturings of populists and demagogues who claim that the world has become too integrated, too globalized, too interconnected for its own good. And in order to answer that question, this is a big question, I found it very useful to think about a schema proposed by Danny Roderick, who's a professor of political economy and who's an economist at Harvard. And he wrote this book for people like me who aren't economists called The Globalization Paradox. And it's very schematic, but I'm just going to introduce it because it really helps me think about this problem. And what Roderick says is that governments and peoples in many corners of the world, particularly in North America and Europe, they basically want three things, albeit in varying degrees. First, they want democracies. They want governments that are responsive to the needs of the people. And in recent decades in North America and Europe, this has also meant that they wanted the social protections of the welfare state in one form or another, and in varying degrees, of course, but basically that's what they want. So they want democracy. Second, they want national sovereignty. They want governments that are capable of acting to protect the economic and political interests of the nation and its people. And thirdly, they want the benefits of free trade on a global scale. They want the benefits of global integration. And that means integrating their national economies and their national labor markets with global markets for labor and goods. When I say they want the benefits, but they don't want all of the vulnerabilities that come with that. But they want some of that in varying degrees. Now, what Roderick points out is that you can't have all three of these things at the same time. You can pick which two you want most, but you can't have all three. And what does he mean by this? Well, you can insist, for example, on democracy and global integration. But if you do this, it will be very difficult to maintain the independence and sovereignty of national governments, who will face challenges on many, many fronts. Political pressures on their borders from the movement of peoples, financial and monetary pressures from the movement of capital. And maybe, just as a thought experiment, you might be able to imagine somebody who made these two choices, or a society that made these two choices, to succeed in establishing some form of democratic government at a global scale. But nobody really imagines this as a solution to these problems in the near future, because it implies a level of political integration that, just we can't imagine it under these circumstances. So a second option under this so-called trilemma is to go for national sovereignty and global integration. Put democracy for aside a bit. And the fact is, this combination works best where governments are not particularly answerable to their populations through democratic elections. And if you think historically, this is roughly how the international gold standard worked in the 19th century. This is particularly late 19th century, where you had levels of global integration that are very comparable to today. Now, under the gold standard, governments and central bankers saw their primary responsibility to be protecting the viability of this system itself. The credibility of the system of international trade and commerce depended upon the convertibility of currencies into gold at a fixed rate. And under this system, countries that were at a comparative disadvantage, say in one particular market manufacturing center, would have to put up with a high level of unemployment in that sector in order to drive down wages enough to erase their disadvantage. Nowadays, you could cut interest rates, but that wasn't possible under the gold standard in the same way. So in a severe economic shock, maintaining stability under this older system would mean tolerating very large levels of unemployment in many sectors for a long time, and this option simply became untenable once governments, under pressures from their democratic constituents, embraced other goals, like, say, full employment, right? So that leaves a last option, according to Roderick. You can insist on democracy and national sovereignty, but to do that, you have to limit the extent to which your economy and your workforce is exposed to the vagaries of international markets, and particularly the unpredictable flows of capital in and out of your country. And this solution is, in fact, roughly similar to the option chosen by the United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan after World War II under the Bretton Woods system. And this, as we know, established rules for trade and financial relations between its signatories and controls on capital flows, right? Now, Western European nations were also party to these agreements, but they soon embarked on their project of European integration, which was both an economic project to create a common market and eventually a political project to create a larger political identity as Europeans. For all of the signatories to those agreements in 45, it seemed rather obvious that democracies that left their populations completely exposed to the fluctuations of global markets might not remain democracies for very long. This is 1945, after the Depression and the Second World War. So the rules established by Bretton Woods were one solution to this problem, and the problem for European integration was another solution. Which brings me to the more recent past. So Roderick and others are now arguing that when the Bretton Woods Accords broke down in the 1970s, governments in North America and Europe responded by embarking on new policies of financial deregulation and global integration. Let's think now Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, George Bush, Bill Clinton, Robert Rubin, Lawrence Summers, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy, even maybe some of the post-Mitterrand generation of French socialists embraced this kind of globalization, deregulation philosophy. And in effect, at that moment, starting in the 1980s, politicians in Europe and North America, the right and the center left, were all saying that we could have all three. We could have democracy, we could have national sovereignty in one form or another, and we could have integration into a less regulated global economy. And what's more, they said we could do all this and still have a more or less functioning social welfare system. And it turns out that that was wrong. Instead, we got the global instabilities that led to the Great Recession. We got increased inequality between the rich and everybody else. After the financial crisis of 2008, we got taxpayer-funded bailouts of the very financial institutions that got us into trouble in the first place. In Europe, we got the Euro crisis, fascist parties in Greece, gains for the National Front in France, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is doing pretty well, I heard this week, and we had Brexit. In the US, the results of this crisis has led to an anti-establishment mood in the electorate. I think this something similar is fueling, at least in part, the Trump challenge from the right, and maybe even some of the Sanders challenge from the left. Trump's challenge, I think, it's to the nature of democratic government itself, insofar as we can find a coherent policy in there somewhere. But he's also calling for a retreat from global obligations and interconnections. And Sanders, too, has called for a step back from global integration, but in this case he's identified different culprits, including the finance industry and business oligarchs. So the Euro crisis since 2009 is, you could look at it maybe as a version of a similar problem taking place in a slightly different political context as a result of what looks now, for the reasons that Daniel explained, like an ill-advised move to a common currency that limited the ability of individual governments to respond to economic disturbances in their countries. The effect of the Euro crisis has been to call into question the desirability of a more integrated Europe, even, as we have seen, in many of the countries who seem to have benefited the most from this integration. The UK, significant population in France, and even Germany now. To a large degree, and this is, I think, worth thinking about, the straw that broke the camel's back in these countries has been debates about the migration of peoples perceived as different. It turns out that in many respects and in many places, many Europeans were willing to pay high taxes for the welfare state only if it was restricted to people that they recognized as being like themselves. Trump, Brexit, Marine Le Pen and the National Front, Pegida, the emergence of alt-right, white nationalist movements are all, in some similar way, the kinds of political pathologies that one can expect from a persistence in the idea that you can have all three of these things at the same time. So some of these populist groups assert ethnic and tribal definitions of national identity in the face of expanded population mobility. Some challenge the legitimacy of democracy itself. All are dubious about the loss of national sovereignty that seems to have come with greater integration into larger political and economic systems, the EU and bigger. Most want to keep existing social welfare provisions, but limit it to members of their tribe. So what next? Well, I've been listening to a lot of pundits, economists. You can listen to their podcasts online. And I keep hearing this phrase, Europe is at a crossroads. The implication of this is that Europeans can either continue to work on the dual project of political and economic integration, ever closer union, or they can become something else. My own suspicion is that they are already something else. We now know that Europe will get smaller before it gets bigger or more integrated. I think that's a distinct possibility. The real question is how much of the post-war project of political and economic integration will survive the downsizing. It may be that a smaller Europe will be a more viable project in the long run, in which case there is room for hope. Or Trump could win in November, and Marine Le Pen could become the French president in May 2017, in which case all bets are off. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josh, and everyone else. We have those little flashcards for you if you fill them out. Please pass them down the aisle, Laura, or raise your hand and Laura will pick them up. And while she's doing this, I just wanted also to say a few words, 3 words about Central European members. So one is the fact that a lot of citizens of Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia actually live in the UK, have bought property, have businesses, their children were born there too. So it causes specific problems for that population. But also at home in those countries too, Brexit gives legitimacy to all sorts of Euroscepticism that was kind of dismissed as marginal, as the ideas of the backwards people of society, etc. The older people, poor people, rural populations, etc. Whereas now the vote is clearly indicating that actually this is a legitimate option. Not that Poland, for example, would be interested in a I don't know how you would call it, an exit from the EU, but actually because now they see the repercussions of what Brexit might involve, but it does give legitimacy to all sorts of nationalist policies, politics that come together with Euroscepticism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiments, for example, all sorts of right-wing agendas. So I have a few questions. Unless you want to comment on each other's, did you have questions or comments on each other's?
Let's hear the questions if you have them.
So you will excuse my, whoa. How did the refugee crisis influence the Brexit vote, more specifically? So I will read 2 or 3, okay. And then you can kind of come with answers. Okay. Why is the British left, in quotation mark, so weak? Why hasn't Jeremy Corbyn been able to activate a greater amount of young voters? Third question, can you discuss the parallels between the EU and the Articles of Confederation? Are there applicable lessons? So this is for you, Daniel.
Oh, yeah.
And perhaps a fourth, is there a reason to think that Brexit was meaningfully motivated by the historic British skepticism of the mainland, and so less about the EU project per se? So I think this is a good first round. Who wants to go first? Daniel, do you want to go first? Or?
Can you hear us?
Yes, the sound just cut out. I just saw you all turning to me.
Okay. Do you know what question we were kind of throwing at you?
I think I did hear the 3 questions. So real quick on the refugee crisis, 2 things. One is the refugee crisis, in my view, is in large part a replay of other crises that the EU has had in the past. It is a lack of member state control over the situation with a failure of the European Union to exercise the powers that it would need to exercise in order to make up for that lack of the member states' power at the local level. Think about it this way. Greece in the euro crisis was stuck with a currency that was too hard for it and a currency whose strength was determined by Germany. Today, Greece is stuck with a welcome mat that is larger than the attraction of Greece holds, and a welcome mat that has been designed by Angela Merkel, telling everybody, just come on over to Germany. So in some ways, Greece in both situations doesn't have the power to control its own situation, but the EU is not stepping in. So in that sense, the refugee crisis is structurally related to, again, the idea of an imbalanced federation. It's yet another example, yet another crisis that is brought to you by the European Union. It's not just a crisis of the world that happens to hit the EU, it's a crisis that is brought to you by the European Union. On the Articles of Confederation, I don't know, we could talk for a very long time. I'm not quite sure what the question is trying to get at. So in some ways, the Articles of Confederation are similar to the EU in the sense that it is this hybrid in between an international treaty organization and an incipient constitution. Actually, some people referred to the Articles of Confederation already back then at the time as our constitution loosely, although it still was very much at the level of not being able to do anything serious unless the member states, back then the signatory states, agreed. We went obviously from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution because the Articles of Confederation were incomplete, they were incapable of preventing trade wars, they were incapable of making sure that the states of the Union back then lived up to their international obligations. So it was too weak, structurally too weak in many ways. So in that sense, yeah, there's a rough analog of having a system that is too weak to be doing the real things that we needed to do. Does that mean, however, that we need to eliminate the EU, the Articles of Confederation, and go to a real constitution in the European Union, as we did in the United States? And there I would say no. I think actually that there are a lot of politics that we could be conducting within the framework of the current treaties that would actually bring about a whole lot of positive change for the European Union. So we can actually start putting people, real politicians, in power in Brussels. That requires no treaty change. We could be running more properly salient elections in the EU. That doesn't require a treaty change. And even Mario Draghi was able to interpret the EU treaties to allow him to engage in the bond buying, which is what he needed to do to stamp down on the euro crisis. So there are ways to bend and work within the EU treaties that would lower the difficulties that the current treaties are being created. Plus, I just don't see it as being an option now to call a constitutional convention to create a real constitution for Europe. They couldn't even do that a few years ago. So those are my preliminary thoughts on that, but depends more on what exactly you want to be asking about there. Thank you.
I have a sense that the refugee crisis question is also directed towards me, which I suppose what I would want to say is that it's another area in which there are longer histories and also confusions of language. That is, some of Britain's obligations in relationship to refugees have nothing, well, if not nothing to do with, a limited amount to do with membership of the EU. There are other treaties, there are other conventions, there are other international agreements. The collapse of refugee issues into other issues of migration and emigration is part of the muddledness or muddiness that I was signaling earlier. There is, of course, also a longer history, and I would recommend, it's been reissued for some obvious reasons, Robert Winder's book, Bloody Foreigners, on the longer history of British relationships to immigrants and particularly to desperate immigrants. So there are ways in which, yes, the EU issue is connected to the refugee issues, but there are also ways in which things are being laid on top of each other and not pulled apart. And what I'm going to say next may sound like just self-congratulation from the Scottish side. Scotland has about 5 million people out of about 65 million people in Britain. It's taken in more than 40% of the Syrian refugees. In other words, different responses are possible even in the context of some of the same structural issues. Now, that is not because Scottish people are necessarily just born nicer. It has to do with existing political cultures, frameworks of language, and the ways in which people understand the relationship between different issues. If you look at the British social attitudes surveys, they find relatively little difference in terms of how English versus Welsh versus Scottish versus Northern Irish people, with some obvious outliers there, have attitudes towards issues of migration or crime or marriage equality or whatever other issues you might want to sort of put under the category of social attitudes. The difference is in the ranking, that is what is seen as the most urgent issue, and also the differences in the frame. So that in some context, every issue, crime, housing, education, poor quality of new comedies on the BBC, is seen through a frame to do with migration. In other context, and for other people, that's not the frame that they use.
I maybe have a quick response that might tie together the question about refugees with the question about the weakness of the left, not just the British left, but the left more generally. And I think we could say, if you look at the way that continued support for a more generous refugee policy or the project of European integration as a whole maps out, in recent elections in Germany, whole neighborhoods in Berlin seem firmly in favor of a more multicultural Germany. They're still voting the populist right-wing parties to less. But the trend is for the left to, in fact, not have a very good line when it comes to the threats that people feel. And this is, I think, a very dangerous moment. And what's happened, I think, is that the general political project behind European integration that is remembered with, I think, such reverence by so many people was a political project that was designed to save Europe from itself. Right? European integration was trying to figure out how to prevent Germany from invading France again, since they did it in 1870, 1914, and 1940. Right? I mean, the European integration was to prevent that problem. In the current environment, where these populist politicians on the right, in an atmosphere of refugee crises and terrorist attacks, the problem is presented as a threat from without. And that political project doesn't seem like it fits the bill. And that's been, I think, the weakness of the left, is that they have struggled because, I mean, my own feeling is that the struggle to maintain an integrated Europe that's open and welcoming to different peoples is the only response that in the long term will prevent the spread of these kind of nihilistic terrorist groups, et cetera. But there's no answer in the short term, right? The chances of further terrorist attacks are pretty high. And that's not, that's an argument that the left is going to lose in the short term.
Yeah, I want to make sure we take more questions, but I just want to put a plug in for an II roundtable we did about 6 months ago on migration and the refugee crisis in Europe, so that you can go in our website and watch that and get more background on this issue.
More questions? I saw people scribbling on their... No? There was one here. I have a hard time reading the first line, but it has to do with whether there's more leadership to encourage a vote to remain within the common market.
you say that again?
Yeah.
I was still
I think
thinking
we're all a
about.
little puzzled.
Can you try? I cannot see the
Brexit
first one.
is a very technical question.
Technical.
Yep, technical question.
Shouldn't we expect? Do you want to state your question?
That was my question.
Yes.
And Brexit is a very technical question.
Absolutely.
And my point is, should not the experts in the economic field have formulated a firm direction and encouraged the people to vote for remaining in the Brexit?
Okay.
Yeah, one of
Should
the
I go? Can I
Go.
read?
Absolutely.
Perhaps that makes
Oh,
more
yes.
sense. I will read two more,
Yeah.
and
Yes,
then we'll
please.
conclude.
Yep.
Okay. Second one, will Brexit result in the continued rise of right-wing populist parties such as UKIP, or will people see the result of Brexit and stop supporting these parties? And that applies not only for the UK, but for a host of other places. Can you compare the different magnitudes of the adverse effects of Brexit for A, civil society and welfare state, B, finance/banking, big money sector? Who will suffer most?
Those are three really good questions. In terms of the role of experts, one, and I think that Daniel will have some things to add on this too. Certainly on the ground, one of the things that seemed to happen was that day after day after day on the television, there was a lot of on the one hand, on the other hand. It was so relentlessly in the same format. It was so relentlessly in that framework of here's an expert who says this, here's an expert who says that, here's a politician who says this, here's a politician who says that there was a good deal of tuning out. Now, I don't want to collapse what I just said into a more general theory of distrust of experts, although I think that was out there, but that the ways in which the press handled knowledge, including the calling out of lies, has and shall continue to draw some criticism there. In terms of the second question, I think it's terribly tempting, but I'm going to stand back from it. The cartoon qualities, the dishevelment, the chaos, the lack of having any sort of sense of having thought about any of the big consequences of what they were proposing. The word grotesquerie was sort of floating in the air a lot in the days after the vote. Certainly did some damage to UKIP, perhaps it's done in some other places as well. The unintended consequences of their victory, of the Brexiteers, is something still spinning out. Daniel, did you want to go on the experts one?
Not particularly. So let me just say, I think what you saw by the politicians, that you saw a kind of full tilt complaint, a full tilt contra campaign. And on the pro campaign, you had just a very measured campaign that sort of, it's kind of better for us to be in. And so you just had kind of an imbalance. I mean, the crazies were giving you a crazy radical message, and the measured folks were giving you the honest truth. Yeah, it's kind of better for the UK to be in the EU, but you can't drum up the same kind of patriotism that you can in the United States for the US. It just doesn't really work that way. So you had, again, you had the little bit like maybe similar to what we're seeing in the US today, although I don't want to get too sort of political in that sense. Now, are you going to see more of this are we going to see more of this throughout the EU? That's sort of hard to say. Yeah. The most immediate reaction that I think some people have seen is that in Spain, the elections that happened just after Brexit actually wound up less radically anti-establishment than they had been predicted. So the pro-democracy party had been poll to really get a whole lot, but they didn't perform that well in Spain. Some people thought that was sort of a sobering lesson, that the radicals and the sort of, obviously it's the voters who are choosing between the radicals and the mainstream, that the voters sitting on the sidelines said, well, maybe we're not going to go all that radical in Spain. AFD in Germany is pretty radically anti-EU, and as Josh said, they just won pretty seriously in Berlin in a frightening way. In Austria, if you look at the Austrian presidential election, the center-right won by a sliver, and the Constitutional Court, for reasons that are inexplicable, throughout the election. Now they're doing a redo, so who knows what's going to happen there. I guess whether or not you're going to see a shift depends on whether the establishment starts listening to part of the anti-EU complaint. And I would just in some ways repeat in part what I said, which is you need to give the EU and trust the EU with more powers, and you need to trust the EU with more politics in order for this to be turned around. If Angela Merkel keeps on running the ship, I think more and more are going to want to jump. And if you don't give them effective powers, people are going to wonder what's this thing all about. So whether this has a knock-on effect will depend on whether folks are starting to listen. And right now it's unclear.
Josh and Pauline, do you want to say concluding remarks, or?
I don't have any particular way to wrap it all up. I sounded so negative and pessimistic. My apologies.
You do that every time.
I know, I do that.
We should never have Josh end the
Right.
sessions. It's always kind of a buzzkill.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that I just got back from London. It's part of why I'm so tired. And so, and I wasn't there. It had nothing to. My visit had nothing to do with Brexit. I was actually there for a conference at the LSE, but I was watching the TV pretty actively, and everything was about Brexit and the consequences of Brexit without much content. I mean, it's still very sensationalist. And Theresa May talking about her mandate to, that the EU is, that the UK is going to leave the EU, and all this talk about us rolling back is nonsense and dragging our feet is nonsense, and so it was full steam ahead. So that I guess I'm not ending on a happier note either. But I mean, I think that's and Daniel brought this up as well. This notion that Brexit's going to be rolled back is nonsense. It's just not going to happen. I think they're just going to try to mitigate the damage, right? That's the best that they can do. And I think that's in the mutual interest of the EU and the UK. So we'll hope that, and the US. I mean, it's in everybody's interest for them to mitigate the damage from this exit.
Yeah, I might want to say something about the structural elements and what Daniel was saying about giving the EU more power. I think that one thing that seems to be forgotten is the class division of those votes and the class-based support for some of these, support for Brexit or here for Trump, for example, and the rise of populism. It's not solely class-based, but there is a class element, and some people who feel like they're losing from the EU. So regions, smaller towns, etc., who don't feel like they have so much to gain from that. So I think that this is also something that politicians need to pay attention to.
I maybe will respond a little bit to Daniel's point. Daniel is suggesting that and I agree, that what ideally would happen is that the EU would develop a federal structure in which the center had real power. And that is a position, in spite of the fact that you don't like the fact that Angela Merkel is running the show, that is a position that Germany has in fact supported at various times. The Germans have imagined and supported a more federal structure for the EU. And the resistance has come from other nations, and particularly the French, who've always insisted on a very strong notion of national sovereignty. And my sense is that although it seems ideal for us looking on the outside, it's unlikely that will happen given the political developments in a place like France, where the calculations of politicians on both the left and the right seems to be that the electorate wants to hear from politicians who are making strong claims for national sovereignty. So Sarkozy has now relaunched his campaign on that note. He's published a book where he's reasserting extraordinary things, including an end to having citizenship from being born in France. All these very, very strong positions, and the socialists themselves seem tempted by these kinds of strong sovereign arguments. So I don't see where the support for this federal structure, an EU with a stronger center, would come.
Do you want me to respond to that? So
Only kindly.
You're right that there's a question of how are you going to build this. That's true, but you.
We lost you.
Oh, he was going to say something brilliant.
Start again.
Oh,
we lost your audio.
Germany and France just announced closer cooperation on military defense, right? So in some ways, one of the responses is great. Now let us finally do all those things that the UK was dragging its heels on and not allowing the EU to do. So let's actually give you a European Union that delivers on some things. I both like it and don't like that message. I like the message because I think, yeah, let's finally create an EU that can deliver. I don't like the message because that treats Brexit as a done deal. I did say that I don't think I can see right now within the UK a movement to reconsider, but I think if some time were to pass and we had a new election in the UK, I wouldn't at all think that it can't be reconsidered. So I don't yet think it is a done deal, but somehow everybody seems to be acting as though it is. And in particular, this would be another one of those examples. But yes, I agree with you. You can't just turn around and say, all right, let's now just write another check to the EU to do all these things. That is very hard to do as well.
I want to zoom back for a moment to something Geneviève said about the role of class and disaffection in what happened in Britain. It is important to remember that the majority of Leave voters were middle-class conservatives, that the attention being paid to Brexit votes as an expression of wholly merited anger and alienation on the part of some dreadfully neglected working-class communities is only part of the story. And also that class and alienation, the class differences and alienation don't necessarily work out in the same way, because Scotland and Northern Ireland are places of at least equivalent post-industrial depression, alienation, and poverty, Northern Ireland in particular. So that there's a lot in terms of pulling apart the psephology that we're going to be carrying on with, I think. And that's true, I'm sure, in the other European context as well.
So we want to thank our guests, and especially Daniel from Germany, for staying up late to be with us. Pauline Jones from the II, and Josh Cole, Kala Israel from the Center for European Studies, Daniel as well. So this was mainly sponsored by the Center for European Studies. It's important that we stay, on top of things. And lots to comment on as the weeks and months follow. So thank you very much for coming and for our speakers.